Hello. Welcome to the Massachusetts General Hospital Frontal Temporal Disorders Unit Community Forum Friday webinar series. My name is Katie Brandt. I'm the Director of Caregiver Support Services and Public Relations, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Dementia and the Law, Protecting Your Loved Ones. This is an incredibly important topic because many families struggle with the changes that a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, or a related disorder may present, especially when there's an intersection with legal and financial decisions that need to be made. I'm thrilled today to welcome two expert speakers to our program to help us better understand this topic. Dr. Judy Ederstein is co-founder and co-director of the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior, an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and an attending psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry at Mass General Hospital. Dr. Edersheim teaches extensively in the legal arena, including lectures sponsored by the Boston Bar Association, the Judicial Institute, and the Mental Health Legal Advisors Committee. She's published articles regarding the intersection of legal and medical concepts in peer-reviewed medical journals, and has been a featured speaker locally, regionally, and nationally regarding issues pertaining to neuroscience, psychiatry, and the law. Dr. Bruce Price is co-founder and co-director of the Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. He's a senior clinical associate in neurology at Mass General and associate professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Neuropsychiatry Fellowship at Mass General and co-founder and associate director of the Frontal Temporal Dementia Fellowship. His fascination with the intersections between medicine, law, and ethics is longstanding, and he's an internationally recognized leader in the field. They are both here today from the MGH Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. I think that you'll find the conversation interesting and informative. And I'm honored to welcome you both to the session. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Price to begin our discussion.
So good morning, everyone in Zoom land. Delighted to be giving this lecture, invited by Katie. Who is also part of Brad Dickerson's laboratory. So first, I think I've been one of the ones that have helped perhaps pave the pathway to Brad Dickerson's rising star, both in terms of clinical care and in terms of research. And understand it's very rare to have someone that is really so good in both arenas, clinical and research. And Brad is that person. He and his lab, including Katie, are clearly contributing to the early diagnosis, to hopefully in the future the biomarker for early onset dementia, such as frontotemporal lobe dementia. Hopefully in the future, ways to prevent, arrest, even cure this dreadful disease. So no pressure, Brad, but get to work, as you always do. Katie, so I see her as a huge and almost kind of mythical, magical force in the FTD community regarding education, counseling, galas. May the next one be in person, which I will hopefully attend, as you all will. So that's the backdrop to why Dr. Judy Ederstein and I are so pleased to really be here presenting to you, and so eager to go back and forth with the many questions which you might have. And so the title of our talk today is Frontotemporal Dementia and the Law, Protecting Our Loved Ones. Next slide, please. So our beginning, our humble beginning of our Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. The punchline here is a young lawyer turned medical student on her way to becoming a forensic psychiatrist walks into my office for a 1-month rotation in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry. We are solicited and produce our first work and it's entitled Neuroimaging in the Courtroom is a Picture Worth 1,000 Words. We did it. It was fun. We looked at each other. We said, this is meaningful. We looked at the void between neuroscience and the law and said, that's us. And we jumped in. So in 2008, Dr. Edersheim and I co-founded the Center at Mass General for Law, Brain, and Behavior. Next. So what's our vision? I'd summate it in terms of 3 bullets. The ultimate worth of science is measured by how much it can contribute to the world, the real world, the ground zero where all of you are on, where this audience lives. And yet we've also been able to recruit a remarkable number of board of directors on our center, as well as faculty advisors. And one of the faculty advisors years ago said a favorite thing that I hold dear for fellow scientists and clinicians. He said, the Center for Law, Brain, Behavior is the place where science can actually have a societal impact on the world at large. And that indeed is our commitment. Better decisions aligned with science lead to better outcomes aligned with justice. So our belief is science led by humanity can be a major force in terms of liberating, relieving suffering and grief. Next, please. So just to briefly introduce you to our Center for Law, Brain, Behavior, in larger font, protecting the elderly from fraud and undue influence in financial transactions, and that's what we'll address today. But just to let you know, we also are involved in juvenile justice and the adolescent brain. Within the next week or two, we'll release what we call a white paper, a guidelines, primarily aimed at judges, lawyers, and policymakers, entitled The Neuroscience of Late Adolescence. So all of us in this audience, and particularly the men in this audience, somehow survived late adolescence, and here we are. And if anyone would you like this paper, probably through Katie, you can contact us and we'll send the PDF on this paper. Third one is psychological trauma, the developing brain, U.S. asylum law and immigration at the border, where we're very concerned about children separated from their families, people put into solitary confinement, and the probably lifelong consequences in terms of emotion, behavior, and cognition. And finally, the role of brain science in criminal responsibility, sentencing, and rehabilitation. So, next, please. Digging deeper into frontotemporal dementia. As patients have said to me, so I'm passing on quotes, several of the caretakers have described it as the long goodbye, the relentless journey, the ongoing funeral, or the journey of shared loneliness. So that gets at the emotional impact. And I'm preaching to the choir, obviously, about this. Young dementia in particular is particularly disheartening because it affects individuals and their families in the prime years. Onset, as you well know, between 40 and 65 typically. By the way, my youngest patient, tragically, we diagnosed her at 18 years of age. She was on her way to nursing school and obviously didn't make it there, but interestingly survived for 25 years thereafter. The second bullet, many patients are initially diagnosed with a psychiatric problem, commonly misdiagnosed as, oh, this is depression. Oh, this is anxiety. Oh, this is just a stress reaction. And it's just not true. Third dot, the diagnosis is often delayed, as above, and knowledge about its management is limited. So you in this audience are the keepers of knowledge in this particular disease. And your mission, should you accept it, is really to spread the news. And finally, it's especially dramatic and challenging for families to acknowledge and adjust. And again, you know that better than I, no doubt. Next slide, please. So the pandemic has fueled abuse, including dementia patients and their families. What are the ingredients? Social isolation, minor children at home, remarkable caregiver stress, fewer staff and families able to visit assisted living facilities, financial vulnerabilities, just the stress of this disease on income and budget alone amongst families, but also vulnerability to online transactions and theft, which Dr. Edersheim will address. And as if that's not enough, it's actually projected, the abuse is actually projected to continue to increase even after the pandemic subsides, and may that come sooner than later. Next slide, please. So let me take you inside the bubble of the healthcare provider's dilemma when facing someone with frontotemporal dementia. So most clinicians, and by that I mean internists, neurologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, neuropsychologists, do not understand testamentary capacity or undue influence, nor do we understand how to assess, prevent, and intervene when we sense that exploitation might be happening. So there are domain-specific instruments to assess cognitive capacity, but they're rarely employed. Instruments such as driving competency, all the way through and including the ability to understand and execute a complex will and estate. There are currently no reliable domain-specific instruments to assess undue influence. Dr. Edersheim will speak more to this, but Katie shared with me the other day, and Judy Ederstein, a recent case, I understand, in which someone with this disorder was scammed for, I think, $75,000, and we can talk more about that issue. The final two questions are bigger question. As clinicians, it begs, how should we optimally respond? We in the trenches respond as physicians and healthcare providers to suspected fraud and undue influence. Who do we contact? Another fault line in the system. And the larger question is, how do we promote an ethical culture within medicine, within science, and within the world at large? And next. So my segue to Dr. Judy Ederstein. Facts. Women on average live 5 years longer than men, regardless of class, education, status, or geography. We don't know why, and it would be a great benefit to our research and ultimately intervention if we could understand what that secret might be. Second fact, the average age of an American widow is 59. That was a stunning fact to me when I found that. Therefore, with advancing age, wealth and assets are most often concentrated in their hands, women and not men. Two red flags, which Dr. Edersheim will dig into much deeper. Bewares. Beware of an isolated elder woman's new best friend forever. What might those motives be? And beware of family members who visit their hospitalized elders with a new estate lawyer. And next. So without further ado, that's me on the right. And I'm bringing to you Dr. Judy Ederstein, my co-founder, who is clearly kind of the leading authority of neuroscience meets the law. And Judy, I think, is our major spokesperson. So I couldn't deliver to you a more competent, enjoyable lecture who will no doubt also fill your tank with thoughts, as hopefully I have as well. Thank you, and I eagerly anticipate the question and answer and response section. Judy Ederstein, Dr. Judy Ederstein, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price, Bruce. It's been a pleasure to go on this journey with you, start the center together, and to be here today. I also want to thank Katie for inviting us to this distinguished group and for including us in your community. So I'm sure this is not the last time we'll see you. And she knows how to get in touch with us for any residual questions that we can't get to in this hour. So I'm going to go at a very rapid clip. I'm a little bit long-winded at baseline, but right now I'm excited about everything I have to tell you. So as I say, I'm going to go at a very rapid clip, but we'll have time for some questions afterwards, which Katie will deliver, and we're both available. So in terms of today, I want to say a preamble. Dr. Price began introducing this, but financial exploitation is on the rise at home by relatives and caregivers, in financial sectors with unscrupulous professionals, even in healthcare settings, as Dr. Price alluded to with his statement about executors or new estate lawyers coming into a hospital room. These are actual cases that we have been involved with. So however outlandish that sounds, we're not saying anything that doesn't have precedent. In brief, public policy polling data from 2016 shows that 1 in 5 adults over 65 are the subject of financial exploitation. And when you understand how seldom this crime is reported and detected, these are vastly understated statistics. So this is the outline of what I'm going to try to cover today very quickly. I'm going to go briefly over the scope of the exploitation problem. Then I'm going to show you how this works. What are the threats to autonomy and financial security? A taxonomy of scams, testamentary capacity, which is a concept you need to know, undue influence, another concept you need to know. And then perhaps what's most important, once you know what to watch out for, what can you do? So I'm going to show you how to be a watchful eye, show you how to advance plan, and see where technology and monitoring comes into play. So the scope of the problem. This is really interesting. As Dr. Price mentioned, in the US alone, people above the age of retirement, above age 65, hold about 40% of the total assets on the books in the nation. This is, at last look, about $32 trillion in the hands of people who might be some of the more vulnerable folks in the population. And internationally, the stats for financial fraud are topping about $45 billion. So this is, as many have described, the crime of the century, and it needs a rapid and concerted response. So an aging population with a high prevalence of dementia and mild to moderate cognitive impairment, $6.3 billion a year in the US. And there is no nationally coordinated scheme to prevent this from happening. So individual steps are where it's at. The scope of the problem in terms of physical and psychological abuse, I understand, although the focus today is on financial abuse, we need to mention at the outset, just to focus on it a little bit, that vulnerable people aren't just the target of financial schemes, they're also frequent targets of physical and psychological abuse. And you see this old but useful study, 6% of older adults reported significant abuse, way underreported. 25% of vulnerable adults reported significant levels of psychological abuse. This is really interesting. 17% of professional care staff reported committing psychological abuse. 10% of professional care staff reported committing physical abuse. And over 80% reported observing another staff member abusing a vulnerable adult. So it's pretty clear they're underreporting their own abuse, or that 10 to 80 spread wouldn't occur. So I wanted to go over some of that before we focus and drill down on some financial security issues. It's all underreported data, but I did want to point this out. So where do these threats to autonomy and financial security come from? Well, the perpetrators are just whom you would expect, a diverse array: strangers, criminal networks, employees, home repair, personal care, family members, attorneys, and financial advisors. And I'm going to drill down a little bit on these categories. So I wanted to show you some of the most popular scams that don't involve family members. This is the hit parade. I made the slide, so it's a little fuzzy, but not bad. The home repair game. This is something you need to understand if you're going to protect your loved ones and, frankly, yourself. This is the way that this works. This is a gateway fraud. Let's posit that Mrs. Ward Cleaver gets a phone call from a handyman saying he can offer her a discount to clean her gutters because he's working in the area. he might drop the name of affiliations that she knows, her church group, her synagogue, her schools, friends. All of this is readily available on Facebook and other apps, social media apps. So the repair person says, I'm working on your friend's, you know, your friend from the Methodist church, I'm working on her house down the street. I can offer you a discount. So why don't I do that? So he comes over, he's up on the roof, and he goes through the house to get to the roof, and notices that a stair rail is loose. And he says, this is a terrible thing. It's going to represent rotting floors. You should give me $4,000 before this collapses and hurts somebody. Then, when you have access to the inside of the house, this is a gateway scam. So you can get credit cards, social security information, and all kinds of things. And then the horse is out of the barn. That's the home repair game. This grandparent ruse was in USA Today a couple of days ago, actually, another instance of it. This is one of the most common anonymous frauds. A grandmother or a grandfather gets a call, and the call starts out, Grandma, is this you? It's your favorite grandson. And then she says, Tommy? And he says, yes, it's Tommy. You know, I was taking a trip and the police stopped me and they won't let me go unless you give me $1,000 cash. I'm going to send my lawyer over. And it proceeds like this. It's either an internet transfer of funds. So a grandmother who was being scammed last week turned the tables on the scammers, invited them over, used her doorbell camera, stuffed an envelope full of paper towels, and the scammers were arrested. But short of being CSI grandma, that's a little much to ask. So beware of the grandparent ruse. The jury pool scam. This preys on the altruistic nature of the population we're talking about. Civic-minded, community-minded, optimistic, generous. The jury pool call actually says, it's time for your jury service. We need to update our records, but you need to give us your birthday and social security. Don't you want to serve? And you feel valuable and you feel part of things and you give this information over the phone. And again, the horse is out of the barn. Then the lottery scam. This is a mail scam. You received something in the mail, your loved one received something in the mail that says you won $2.5 million in the lottery. Send back $30 as a processing fee. Plus, we, of course, are going to have to report your earnings to the federal government. So we need your birth date and social security number. And then we will begin to process your magnificent winnings. So they keep the $30, then they add your numbers to a scam registry. So these are very common scams, and it's a disaster once you're on one of these dark web lists. So who's targeted? Who are these scams against? Well, the National Adult Protection Services Association, and I have a list of some resources for you at the end, gives this profile. The typical target of abuse, and this is typical, it varies greatly, someone between the ages of 70 and 89, frail, homebound, some underlying medical conditions, trusting, and where we can drill down is cognitively impaired, isolated or lonely, with some underlying psychological vulnerabilities, which makes perfect sense. I'm going to have to go quickly, but the psychological vulnerabilities that they were talking about would be actually a personality constellation, and I've been involved in some of these cases, so has Dr. Price. Gregarious people who enjoy and depend on social interaction. I'm not like that, so this is not an area where I'm vulnerable. Will face severe deprivation if they're isolated and they're unable to control their social circumstances. So ill-meaning others can easily manipulate that drive to be a gatekeeper for social contact and then control someone. Substance use in this realm, I see mostly alcohol, as it promotes poor health, poor brain functioning, poor sleep, poor nutrition, but also polypharmacy. There have been high-profile cases where some of these scams have been perpetrated by folks using sedating antipsychotic medication to control impaired people and make them more impaired. Loneliness, isolation, grief, that's clear. And some psychiatric disorders, depression in the elderly, anxiety, thought disorders, all of those can contribute. If we had 5 hours, we could go through this list, and usually I do, but I'm going to move on. So one word about depression. Just remember that depression and anxiety have a great comorbidity, and they're complicated with cognitive decline in these scenarios, and often some other underlying medical conditions like diabetes, heart disease, or a malignancy. So it's a perfect soup, and people recognize it and take advantage of it. I want to drill down on what you can change. What you can change is understanding how these frauds and abuses are perpetrated and how to combat them. So scammers have a playbook, no matter what the scam and what the modality. You promote isolation, you foster dependency, you create a siege mentality where you are the gatekeeper to everything important and everything that matters. You create and reinforce a sense of powerlessness in a victim, and sometimes even enhancing fear and vulnerability. This last one is important, and I'm going to show you how to combat it. You control the flow of information and enforce a state of information ignorance, which lets the scammer or the influencer fill in the blanks and then manipulate the environment to deprive someone of email, of telephone messages, of texts. So I wanted to give you an example of this in case you think it's completely outlandish. There is a playbook here. It's well-worn, it's over-practiced. Most stranger perpetrators do this more than once. So this is a personal scam, and I wanted to raise it to you. This was a Boston case. It's called the Putty Cat case. A 73-year-old woman with no natural heirs was living alone. She was cognitively impaired, moderate impairment, and isolated. She had a $500,000 estate, and part of it was left to her cat in trust, the Putty Cat Trust, and the rest was left for several animal welfare agencies. Enter her neighbors. Now, what was really interesting about this was that this is called an identity shifting scam. She didn't know this was two people. This was actually two neighbors who had doctored driver's licenses and pictures to pretend they were one person to operate this scam. They offered to care for her cat, which ingratiated them. They obtained a power of attorney over her financial affairs, and then they appointed estate administrators. They had themselves appointed administrators of the estate. This is actually the two of them at their arraignment because they were caught on this brazen criminal scam. But what they did was that they made a $500,000 estate into an estate worth $2.16. They depleted cash for personal items, computers, cars, actually. The power of an attorney was granted, and then they transferred her to a nursing home immediately. And they transferred her condominium to them for $1 to avoid probate, to avoid it going into probate upon her death. So that scam was particularly brazen and was according to a regular playbook. But then eventually they had to plead guilty to 80 counts of fraud. They got 2.5 years each in prison and 5 years of probation, and had to pay restitution, but they had already spent the money. They also made Social Security and Medicare fraud out of it. But what happens, so that's a criminal scam, not on the line, not marginal, not debatable, and involved multiple federal agencies. So a criminal case was easy to prosecute. What if it's a less clear cut? What if a predatory child or a predatory spouse or someone else assumes control, appeals, gets a power of attorney, transfers assets, structures a trust of which he or she is the beneficiary? What are the legal standards, and how will understanding what they are help you avoid this in the first place? So I'm going to show you how the courts handle these things in order to have you stop them. The two doctrines are testamentary capacity and undue influence. So testamentary capacity is whether you have the capacity to dispose of your assets and make a valid will. So the basics of testamentary capacity: adults are presumed to have capacity to undertake legal tasks. So the person challenging has the burden of proof, and the burden of proof is high. So the party challenging has the burden, and the standards are transaction specific. What that means is that you have to have the capacity to undertake the task you're doing. My estate is not complicated. I am not Warren Buffett. So the capacity I have to execute transactions about my estate is going to be smaller than Warren Buffett's. If you have a rented condo and $43, that's the capacity you have to have, enough to dispose of that. But if you have a more complex situation, then the courts are going to slide their scale for what they expected. The probate is an ancient doctrine, and it uses ancient words. I didn't make them up, so you'll have to forgive me. We are using precedents from the 1800s. So at the time of the will execution, a testator has to know the meaning of a will, know that there exists a class of individuals who are natural heirs, the people you would normally expect to give your money to, called the natural objects of your bounty, which is kind of cute. Know the extent of one's assets and understand a general plan of distribution to the heirs. How does your will say things are going to be divided? The language varies from state to state. You don't have to know all this, but that's the general outline. So testamentary capacity is a cognitive standard. So it implies deficits imposed by neurodegenerative disorders, traumatic brain injury, very severe psychiatric disorders sometimes rise to the level of being incapacitating, and neurodevelopmental disorders are now more prominent in this arena. Again, I could spend days on all of this, but we're not going to. So it's a cognitive standard, meaning it implicates these abilities: semantic memory, verbal abstraction, verbal comprehension. How do you know the extent of your property? You don't have to know it to the last dime, but you have to know that your condominium is worth $50,000, not $5,000. Knowing the extent requires semantic memory, long-term historical memory, short-term memory. The objects of one's bounty means that you have to remember who means something to you and why. And then an asset distribution plan, an integration of all these abilities to decide, how does this work prospectively? How is this going to go in my decision tree of asset distribution? What about undue influence? That's basically testamentary capacity, a cognitive understanding of how you're distributing your assets. But what about something else? Cognitive deficits are usually not alone in these scams and in allegations that a will or a trust is invalid. They're usually joined by a concept called undue influence. And that's really about the overbearing of someone's will. It's not about not understanding. It's about being coerced in some way. And it's based in legal notions of fraud or duress. So what is undue influence? Well, because it's based in fraud or duress, it comes out of the nature of contract law, and the restatements of contract is like an encyclopedia for contracts. So undue influence is unfair persuasion of a party who is under domination of the person exercising the persuasion, excuse me, or by virtue of the relation between them is justified in assuming that a person will not act in a manner inconsistent with his welfare. Well, that's a mouthful, but it's typically about fraud and duress. And it can be present even with full cognitive capacity. You can overbear someone's will by virtue of their constellation of personality, your role in their life, and your dominion over them. And I'm going to show you how. Usually it's a combination, but you can void a will because of duress. Impaired capacity, of course, increases the vulnerability of undue influence, and so they go hand in hand. There are lots of models of undue influence. We don't have time to go through all of them. As Dr. Price said in his introduction, there is no uniform scheme and no validating instrument because it's so person specific, but it all comes down to isolation, dependency, and manipulation. That's how this happens. So what are the red flags? I want to get drilled down here because these are the red flags you should be looking at. A confidential relationship allowed the influencer to control the testator. So someone close starts manipulating a person. The influencer was active in the procurement of an asset change. Nephew comes to stay for a month and decides to take aunt to the estate lawyer and goes with her. The influencer received a significant benefit. If there's no motive, there's usually no crime. The changes were unnatural and inconsistent with prior wishes and values. First, an entire family was included, and then it becomes only the housekeeper. And I'm involved in a case right now of exactly that. The testator had underlying vulnerabilities, neurologic disease, substance use disorder, other psychiatric illness. So that's the flag book. But I want to talk a little bit, we don't have time to go into the medical vulnerabilities and the psychological vulnerabilities. That can be for another webinar. But the social context, the isolation and control, I want you to be able to recognize this so you can protect your loved ones. So we're going to skip this slide, medical and psychological, and we're going to go straight to social context. You can control this just by being vigilant. Be careful when trusted others perform multiple roles for a victim. Dr. Price and I were involved in an internationally known contest, and we could call this the major domo effect, meaning someone begins to control everything in a household and the dependency becomes complete and the flow of information stops. The victim views this trusted person as irreplaceable and primary. And there is physical isolation. This person begins to have dominion over who visits. I'm sorry, Susie doesn't want to see you now. Why don't you try again next week? Controlling mail, phone, email. In a case I'm involved in now, the phone, email, and mail were all sequestered and all messages went to the housekeeper's voicemail. Controlling access by family and friends. Isolation is key. Now, undue influence also involves a kind of psychological manipulation. The trusted person starts promoting false beliefs about others, friends, family, encourages suspiciousness or delusions that emerge in the context of a memory deficit. So nephew will visit, a very lovely visit, and leave. Then the victim will say, oh gosh, I can't find my wallet. And the influencer will say, well, your nephew was just here. I wonder if he took it. People who have cognitive impairment leave their stuff all over the place. I leave my stuff all over the place. But attributing a bad motive fills in a gap between memory and reality. So they encourage negative or hostile feelings toward previous beneficiaries or objects of generosity. They distort why trusted others aren't visiting when they're prohibited from visiting or communicating. This is particularly bad during the pandemic when you're trying to explain why your family can't visit and you have someone saying they just don't want to. They don't want to see you. I'm the only one who's here. I'm the only one who cares for you. And this is really common. It sounds egregious. It isn't. It's absolutely garden variety. So this is what I want you to do. This is a little sassy, but I'm going to say it anyway. What can you do? You can plan. You can plan for the future. Why don't you? Well, here we get into a little bit of psychology. Why don't you? So this is a pharaoh overlooking all of his property with his child, and he's saying, just so you know, I'm taking this all with me into the afterlife. One of my most favorite supervisors in psychiatry residence used to say, you know, denial ain't just a river in Egypt. So denial, you're in denial about yourself, about others, about how long you have. And this is very common. In fact, this is how people get into trouble, where it is too late to fix documents and too late to intervene. So what are the technical barriers to people implementing financial protection? Failure to place fiduciaries in positions of responsibility. One must give up some autonomy to share control. Use of attorneys and fiduciaries that are older than you are, or older than the grantor or the testator. I'm not being ageist. Your 75-year-old estate lawyer can draft your documents, but you cannot plan on them being there if you need them in 25 years. That would be lovely, but it's not the person you choose. Failure to share information with family, either secrecy, surprises, or shame. And failure to teach young folks about how to manage assets and participate in financial decision-making so that your options for delegating are too narrow. You want your intelligent 30-year-old son to do this, or daughter to do this. And you want to be able to share and be open if they're trustworthy. So what can you do? You're asking me out there, I hear you saying, all right, tell me exactly what I can do. This is exactly what you can do. David Leibson is a wonderful professor at Harvard Business School who specializes in this area. These are the instruments that you can use when your denial fades. And so a durable or springing power of attorney, this allows someone you trust to assume the financial reins in case of an emergency. You can give this power to more than one person. If you want to spread the duties, you can even tailor this power to someone and customize the management. I only want this person to manage my taxes. I only want this person to manage my bank accounts. You can appoint a trusted contact, someone you authorize your banker or your broker to contact in the event of questionable activities in a financial asset account or in a bank. Now, the FINRA, which is the financial industry's regulatory body, one of them, actually requires banks and brokers now to ask for a trusted contact when they open any kind of fiduciary account. Healthcare proxy is absolutely necessary for everyone. So someone to whom you delegate healthcare decisions when you can't make them. It's only when you can't make them. So it's a built-in protection. But you need a living will to guide people on how you want decisions made. What kind of interventions do you really want for your health if you can't make them? What kind of quality of life do you place at a premium while you can think through these decisions? A last will and testament is very important. You don't want your wishes and your aspirations and the objects of your bounty to be decided by someone else. And a living revocable trust is a little bit more of a complicated instrument that you're going to need if you have a complex estate. What it does is it sets up a grantor trust in your lifetime where you put your assets in so they're protected from other people while you're living, and they don't go into your estate when you die. They don't go into the probate courts. That requires sophisticated estate planning, and those with sophisticated estates might want to consider that. It's revocable when the grantor is competent, but that might be too much detail. So most financial professionals, and we've talked about caregivers, we've talked about relatives, most financial professionals work very hard and are honest. For the few who don't, it can wreak havoc for assets. So there's lots of federal regulation and it still is inadequate. So I would like you to follow some steps to monitor your financial dealings. Is the advisor moving money frequently? That's very unusual for someone whose estate is fixed and stable and has asset goals already set. Now, I'm not saying any change in assets is unwise. You have a good financial advisor in order to change with the times and the circumstances, but changes that are too frequent generate fees and might be suspect. Is the advisor recommending major changes in allocation that actually generate fees but don't improve the financial situation? Does the advisor fail to return calls and messages from you? That's not good. Preventive measures. Make sure financial advisors know you and other family members and that you're watching, essentially. Ask upfront about fee structures. I'm not sure you want to engage in a fee structure that rewards trading as opposed to taking a fixed fee based on asset allocation. If you're concerned about this, ask someone who knows. I wouldn't be able to tell where assets should be allocated, but my accountant might. My accountant might be able to say, or my tax attorney might be able to say, wow, this really doesn't look right. And you could do that. And then finally, I have some tips on reporting. So what about interpersonal safeguards? Those are for financial things, but Social isolation increases the risk of financial fraud and exploitation, and COVID has really upended contact with families. Family gatherings may not be wise. Being in a crowd may not be wise, particularly if you have underlying conditions and can't screen for who is vaccinated, who is boosted, and who is wearing a mask. So the 2020 review by the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau found that 1 in 9 incidents of financial exploitation, the target knew the perpetrator as a relative or a caregiver. And this is way underreported. So maintain contact, regular visits, regular phone calls, or technological contact if you can't do the calls and visits, texts, emails. Encourage links through communities, volunteering groups, social affiliations that you can lean on as a safety net for your loved ones. Be alert to anyone discouraging contact with family or friends. That is perhaps the worst one of all, because then your avenues for correction are limited. Know the caregivers. I think if you have a vulnerable person in the family or a vulnerable person, it is worth paying a premium to go through a bonded and insured agency to get help and not go onto a website that doesn't have bonding or insurance and doesn't do adequate background checks. You have to have a plan to supervise and monitor caregivers. Are they asking for supplemental cash? Is the caregiver providing fresh food? Are they properly administering medications? Is your loved one clean and properly groomed and clothed? Contact, contact, and contact. So this was Know the Caregivers, and this one is Watch the Caregivers. I'm involved in a case right now in upstate New York, a disaster, where an entire vast estate was transferred into the name, including homes, cars, property, cash, into the name of a housekeeper of a modestly cognitively impaired individual. And every antique in the house was sold before family members could look at the inside of the house. So secure valuables, cash, and cards. Make surprised unannounced visits. If you are too far away to make surprise unannounced visits, then ask a neighbor to do the same. Install doorbell video cameras to see when caregivers come and go. And in some states, this is prohibited, but some states will allow, so you have to know which state you're in for this, allow video cameras in common areas. Ask for view-only access to bank and credit cards. What are you looking for? So you have no withdrawal. So you can say, look, I don't want to take money from you. I don't even want to have any authority. I just want to make sure everything's okay. It's like checking on you and your credit card. Watch for unusual financial activity, large or frequent unexpected withdrawals or fund transfers, changes to new account formats, because that allows back doors into the accounts, a new signatory to financial transactions. In the New York State case, the perpetrators, there was more than one, convinced the victim of this scam to sign a power of attorney. So watch for signatures. Sudden overdrafts or unpaid bills that are very unusual, changes obviously to wills, trusts, and powers of attorney. So this is what I want you to watch for. There are technological solutions. You should know I have no interest in any of these, nor does Dr. Price. We are not consultants to these. I took the logos off the internet so that you would see there's a vast array. There are also articles ranking the attributes, the best technological solutions for you. So what these companies do is that they try to prevent this kind of fraud by doing the drill down monitoring on accounts that you cannot do. So for a monthly subscription fee, which is modest in comparison to what you're risking, like $10, $20, these services help avert fraud. So for example, there's something called TrueLink. For $10 a month, TrueLink will supply prepaid Visa debit cards that will allow you to set withdrawal amounts that cannot be exceeded, and that will block certain merchants like liquor stores or casinos. Something like EverSafe systematically monitors and flags suspicious transactions across multiple accounts, or things that banks often miss. And there's a Careful, which I put up here, monitors banking and credit card statements for common mistakes like duplicate charges, income that wasn't received but should have been received, new or changed spending, or identity theft. So these kinds of services are an option for you, and drill down in a way that most of us would be unable to do. Some of them also assist in loss recovery and notification of the police. So that's really useful. So I wanted to end here with some resources. There are many hotlines, reporting agencies in the Massachusetts state government, mass.gov, and nationally in nonprofits and in federal government agencies. I'm happy to give any of this to Katie if she wants to make a distribution. I could have made this 20 items longer at least. So I'm going to stop there and tell you that we have a beautiful website. We have Twitter. We have everything, and we would love for you to become part of our community as well. CLBB at mgh.harvard.edu, and there are some case studies in our elder fraud and financial fraud section that you might be interested in, with respect actually to frontotemporal dementia and other impairments, and they're all open and free to you to view. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Dr. Edersheim, thank you so much. And Dr. Price, thank you as well. You know, the first thing that I really need to comment on is what I appreciate so much about both of you. The way you approached the beginning of your presentation was with real compassion for our community and the challenges that they're facing. You know, I think a lot about how caregivers are required to gain so much new knowledge in so many topic areas, medical decisions that they were never thinking about before, care planning, and this incredible sense of legal issues that they must consider. And so I appreciate the resources that you presented, and even just the vocabulary. I think sometimes our caregivers, they don't even know what to ask, right? So one question I would like to present to both of you is, if you're a caregiver who's listened to this presentation and you're thinking, boy, you know, I didn't even think about these things before my loved one, started showing concerning symptoms. And now I'm in a place where I think I might be too late. I'm worried. Who could help that caregiver get their loved one on the right path to a more secure, stable, and safe legal and financial situation?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Most of us wait too long, no matter what our circumstances. And I met psychological denial. It's very hard to imagine that anything would happen. And it's very hard to imagine that there are predators out there, because everyone feels great compassion and feels that most of the world is full of well-meaning and caring people. But of course, lawyers live in the land of worst case scenario, and they are the ones to go to when you need to plan for unforeseen circumstances. So I mentioned that capacity to execute documents is task specific. Mm-hmm. So going to a estate lawyer or a probate lawyer who specializes in the planning of documents, that person will and has a fiduciary duty to evaluate whether the person before him or her has the capacity to execute documents. Now, this is not going to be a minute detail, but so here are some advantages. If you have someone you have already dealt with, if you have someone who already knows the wishes, previously expressed wishes of the person who is now more impaired than at last visit, that is a great asset if this ever becomes litigation, because you're trying to effectuate the wishes of the person who is vulnerable. And consistency with prior documents and prior wishes is to great advantage, because it memorializes a history of relationships. That's one thing. So going to an estate lawyer and saying, I want to maximize the protection I can get for my loved one with the capacity that he or she still has to articulate those wishes, and in an instrument which is appropriate for the task. So trusts, for example, can be executed during life. You don't have to wait till someone has passed. And protecting assets in that trust will protect from third parties and effectuate wishes. So that's a very good solution. And of course, the interpersonal solutions are about the surveillance, essentially, that I've just recommended with respect to keeping your loved one's environment safe so that the assets aren't subject to any intervention, any undue seizures.
So I'm thinking specifically about our frontal temporal dementia population. And what you just mentioned, Dr. Edersheim, can be particularly complicated with those patients living with behavioral variant FTD, where maybe their preferences for who's important in their life or what their values are may look different, in their present state. And so, Dr. Price, I'm wondering, how have you helped families who come to you and say, we've been married for 35 years. Our will was set that we would leave things to our children. And now my loved one is saying that they want to give everything to their new friend at the gym, or, anything that's sort of that outrageous. But
Right.
how do you help families cope with symptoms that impact values?
Right. Fair question, Katie. Let me backtrack first and respond to your first question. I hope we aren't introducing undue panic, undue paranoia. But I don't want to make everyone suspicious now who's to the left, who's to the right. But this is a very specific problem that needs early recognition and early intervention. I think we all, as we grow older, take pride in learning curves. And my learning curve is certainly over the last 12 or 13 years with the Center for Law Brain is to actually step inside the mind of a lawyer. Lawyers in medicine, we're told to run for your life, right? Well, in fact, lawyers are very important people, and they adjudicate how we live our lives. So I've had to let go of old stereotypes and welcome good lawyers, of which there are plenty. And I think every time I listen to Dr. Edersheim, I learn anew. But it's a whole vocabulary. It's a whole philosophic difference. It's like, what the heck is testamentary capacity? What is fiduciary responsibility? What is undue influence? So these are things that I've had to undergo. And then the question you're saying is really, how do I take this knowledge and use it patient by patient specifically? So just to reiterate what Dr. Ederstein said, and here's the problem, there's, at least in Alzheimer's disease, there's usually a 2 to 4 year delay between clinical onset and official diagnosis. And I would imagine, I don't know the statistic, but there's a delay of several years, I would imagine, in the world of FTD, behavioral variant FTD. So you're already a little bit behind the 8 ball. But to me, the earlier the recognition, the earlier the intervention, and what Dr. Edersheim said, the earlier you can ask the patient, the loved one, what are their specific wishes, in terms of will, testament, future, charity, estates, wills, etc., is really important. And if they seem consistent with their past values, then that's good, and I would fix it and almost make it immutable as the future plays out. But often, though, it's in this situation, this is when you have to get a really good, competent, very compassionate, very experienced elder lawyer on board, really, to protect you. And it's not just protecting you or your loved one, it's protecting your family and literally future generations. The problem with the behavioral variant is that early on, you get vast decrements in insight, awareness, judgment, ability to understand implications for future. And that's the very heart of the disease. So this is why it's so vulnerable and why it's so important to catch it early and record, even by video if you can, what might be who they really are when they were totally intact and what their wishes might be.
Thank you for that. Dr. Edersheim, do you have anything to add?
I think along the lines of what Dr. Price was saying, and I'm going to really oversimplify because it's important. A good estate lawyer will drill down on this properly, but maybe the concept should be a good change in an estate plan is difficult when someone is impaired, but a bad change is also difficult. So you gave the scenario of someone saying, I want to give everything I have to my personal trainer. At that point, you are both documenting impairments, which need to be documented, and probably are in the course of treatment. So the medical record is a protection against that, because the new wishes will be supplanted by the last intact wishes. That's what courts do. They say, well, when he or she was intact and expressing wishes that seemed authentic and legitimate and not a product of illness, then this is what he or she decided and this will stand. And anything forward of that will be considered illegitimate. It's not a situation you want to get into, but as I mentioned very briefly, attorneys have fiduciary responsibilities when they are doing estate planning. So for example, if your spouse says, honey, I really love you, but I'm leaving everything to my personal trainer. I'm going to go to our lawyer, Joe, and ask him to redo everything. The wise thing would be to call Joe and say, Joe, I think you might get a call. I'm reminding you that you have a fiduciary duty to make sure that your client is intact when you're redoing an estate plan. And there are some concerns right now. You don't have to be idle if things are going awry, because it would be a violation of an attorney's fiduciary duty to not verify that someone is intact before changing an estate plan.
I think that's a very direct course of action that caregivers can take and incredibly helpful. And as we wrap up today, I guess, one final question I have is, how would you advise caregivers and family members of loved ones with cognitive impairment to open the conversation with their loved one's provider about how can we address these issues so that as changes happen, as we move from that place of fully able to make authentic decisions on their own to needing full support for everything, where's that space in the middle where families and clinicians can work together and also protect the personhood and dignity of the individual living with the diagnosis?
To me, that's easy. Call Katie Brandt. She fills that space, and you do it so well. But it helps to have a coordinated team like you and Dr. Brad Dickerson and all of the people that are clinically and research based there, because you now have the experience. You run these groups. You hear these remarkable questions that people who love their spouse, love their father, love their mother, but see the diminishment and need to protect their loved ones. So that's the beginning. We give this talk to various groups because we want to spread the information. And then now the duty, if you accept, is for you all to take this and spread it even further, because there's lots of voids in the law. It's very frustrating. The law changes at the speed of a glacier, and we're part of that change agent, and it's both enlightening and frustrating at the same time. But the overall thing is we are absolutely all in this together. So let's hold hands and move forward.
I think that's tremendous. Dr. Edersheim, Dr. Price, thank you both for being a part of our session today. I'm extending a special word of gratitude for the Center for Law, Brain and Behavior, not only for your time and expertise today, but for the work that you're doing in the community on behalf of the vulnerable individuals who need your support and guidance.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Carry on.
The Massachusetts General Hospital Frontal-Temporal Disorders Unit is a clinical research program dedicated to providing the highest quality of care while working tirelessly towards a cure for Alzheimer's disease, frontal-temporal dementia, and related conditions. We thank you for being a part of our session today and hope that you stay safe and well.